The next session had to interact with the half god from down below, um, and a remarkable charisma save. Basically solves a lot of problems that were waiting to happen or had partly happened, because the god's not very nice. Okay, this is the half that's very beautiful, but also a total dick. And so it took a little work, but they actually managed to, you know, say, you know what, we talk about this broken half thing. I mean, the other half's around. We'll find the other half for you, right? And that was the right thing to say, and a good charisma roll went with it, and all sorts of other things. And so basically, the god blesses them, and they get some hits back and stuff like that, and they are going to get promised, a bigger reward, and they get, verbally insulted liberally throughout all of this, because it's not a nice this is not the nice half of the god's personality. um but they're like, okay, we've got more going on here, and bit of a problem, and we may have another problem with this god thing, but let's deal with this first. So that led to the first skirmish with the remaining bandits, which had to do with taking that cliff face. The nice thing was that the monster cat thing was out of the picture. In fact, turns out to be kind of a lazy shit, because it just wants you to keep giving it bodies. Fortunately, there's bandit bodies around, and basically would prefer to just lie around and, be fed. Doesn't really want to go fight for you. But at least that kept it out of their hair when they went up and took the first platform in front of the cave, so that the only bandits remaining were driven into the cave. Little did they know that that's where all the scariest ones are, that are the most mutated, and the corresponding altar above, which is a little more dangerous. I was really giving off the idea these broken god halves are spilling mystic radiation off of themselves, which is what was giving the spider beings their powers, and was also up here is basically turning the bandits into terrifying brutes. It's also why the cat thing became the cat thing. Well, too much explanation. What's going on here? We're still that's 4 sessions in. The final two sessions. Session number 5 was particularly dramatic. They had a pretty good idea of what they wanted to do. They wanted to rejoin the halves. They quickly were able to spot the other half of the little relic thing, and um, they were in a lot of trouble, because these guys had had a lot of time to prepare. So I really set up tactically what was going to be happening. That the mutated bandits are who are very monstrous, and if they get you, then you have to save versus poison or be terrified. And anyway, um, their whole tactic was to try to break up the players' formation, so that they could separate them into smaller groups, which means littler dice pools, right? Separate dice pool fights. And they also, were very stealthy. Well, this is where the players' roles came into things very distinctly. Some perception checks were made, some were not. So some of the attacking groups, the little trios of the mutant bandits, were actually not. They couldn't tell where they were. And it's very shadowy in there, and all sorts of things. Lots of places to hide and lurk. So uh, the the fighting in this case turns out to be quite desperate. A notable moment when our leprechaun character succumbs to the scary poison, and bolts to run out of the cave, and has to make an intelligence saving roll to keep from running straight off the cliff, which he does. Um, and a number of other things. The bad luck in certain aspects of the rolls lead to two characters who had actually protected the leprechaun from getting butchered while he was terrified, but he ran off from them once he was protected. They found themselves cut off from the rest of the group and had to fight these 3 mutant bandits on their own, and they were killed. So this was very sad, actually. One of them was Sven Tvoa, who had rapidly developed a personality, and the other was Remy, the archer, who had very much turned into kind of the clear-eyed, leader character, and it was very sad for both of these two people, to die. And they had done so very heroically, saving, Kree the Leprechaun. And anyway, um, so that really motivated everybody. Everyone, the rest were pretty pissed off, and they gave some thought to what to do. Kree had recovered his wits, fortunately. Um, the fairy, characteristically, causing havoc. It was very difficult in this fight, and because the mutant bandits were not prone to being startled or annoyed by a fairy zipping around their heads like other foes had been. So the Kree, the leprechaun, and this fairy were able actually to get the artifact off of Remy's body, um, and fly it up there and drop it down for Kree to, put the two halves together. This was a big deal. This meant that the other half god came off the ledge in all of its terrifying, awful, fanged, distorted, ugly, majesty. And of course, this is the half that has the really terrifying evil body, but the really, really nice personality. So it's actually really nice. But that blends them together. This begins the rejoining, of the two halves of the god. So that was the fifth session. The sixth was the interaction with the rejoined god, and a brief battle with some of the after effects. Because you see, the top one, they were able to stop the terrifying radiating effects of the half god because he was joined. But down below, they had never been down to their lowest level, and the effects that I had put down there, are basically still down there on the map. So I figured they kind of boil up and are creating a tactical problem in front of the mountain. Um, let's see. There were a couple of interesting aspects of that. It was very okay. We have these two rows of columns, and then we have the goo coming out of that same tunnel that I mentioned before, and it's creeping along uphill, right? It's flowing uphill. This sticky, fluidy, nasty stuff is just liquid enough, to be flowing, and it's going up. And when it hits a pillar, there's all these magical zapping effects, and a humanoid form of energy appears, and that happens at each pillar. And the round after that, all of the existing ones of those join into a bigger one. So this has just begun, and in fact, I think the characters who are kind of still keeping a lookout during the fight spot this happening, and they're trying to figure out what to do to stop this. Um, this is where a lot of really interesting tactical thinking happens. A dwarf character, and they're quite strong, actually thinks of building a little dam, because it's clear, that it takes longer for the thing to get over. So just building a little barrier saves them some time, of getting from pillar after pillar. Um, Fighting these things is pretty hard. If you fail a certain saving throw, you will be basically thrown, basically through shock. You will be zapped and thrown backwards, and um, that happens to one of the characters who almost dies. And then it turns out to be Kree the Leprechaun, again, kind of redeeming his terror earlier. Finally manages to get down to the little door, and close it with, the what is there of a door. It's just enough to be technically a door. Is able to close it with Loctite. And the fight in and of itself, as the players sort of traded off, okay, am I going to fight this thing individually? Are we going to fight the big one that's forming? How are we going to cut them off from reforming and stuff like that? Actually ended up being a pretty good nail biter, at the end. And that was basically the end of the adventure. The thing that you should know is that the rejoined god had decided it needed, a century or two. Wasn't sure how long to think about things. the world has changed. And basically says, it expects a really nice temple, and proper worship when it comes back. So you have to do that. Well, there's a spell I said this is the equivalent of this particular spell effect, which is this kind of slavery spell or charm monster, if you will, which they now are subject to. And that doesn't mean that it's absolutely permanent. There's lots of ways to overcome it. They could get it lifted as if it were a curse. They could bulk up their attributes until they are no longer subject to that effect, because it has to do with your attributes and your numbers, whether you're affected or not, and a number of other things too. But for the moment, they suddenly find themselves, in charge of, compelled to have to set up this place as a temple for this god who's coming back who knows when. So, and they're not even sure what its whole deal is. It's like, well, it wants to be worshipped properly, but what is it? What's that? So, I mean, it talked like they should know, but they don't. So that's all kinds of fun. And that ended our first adventure. As it turned out, given the final defeats at that, or the victory, I should say, the final victories at that final fight, that even the newcomer characters who had missed the first two sessions leveled to level 2. The others had all leveled to level 2 in session number 5. So now they're all second level. So that's kind of awesome. We get to watch all those numbers, do what they do. And that was the end of that. We have entered into our next adventure, but that's a story for another time. What are some points about this? What are some insights, perhaps? At the very least, advice and observations. So the first is that my preparation was not as exhaustive as you would expect from a publication. And I strongly suspect that nobody's preparation was ever as exhaustive as what you eventually see in that, in that publication. Specifically, I would write something, and then either with or without printing it out, I would revisit it a few times during the week prior to the session. Sometimes I would think it was done or as good as, print it out, put it in the folder, and then looking at it would, write a few more things on it as further prep that never make it into the electronic, file. And a good example of that is in the first session. You'll see that the prep just says that a particular area has a trap. Well, on my actual piece of paper here, it says, in red, right, the trap, meaning the trap, but you can see the little note that goes over here that I wrote and defines the trap in writing. So I'm holding this during play. Things get confusing because then I write on this during play too, like something gets killed, so I'll put a big X through it, or I'll do a bunch of math next to it or something. So the actual document ends up being a bit of a mutant. I mean, it was the printout, but then it was more further prep in writing, and then it's a post-use document with writing all over it from that. So good luck, archivists, trying to figure out, what I did. But you'll see that in each of the prep files that I made per session. But note what ends up in those. In a lot of cases, I write necessary saving rolls, either to spot things or to resist things, or to avoid certain problems jumping on your head from your spider dude combatant. So it includes those. It includes all the monster ratings, and it includes the treasures, and it includes various other details that I find necessary. But it's not written as like an entertaining paragraph. It's just written in note language, and a couple of things about characterization here and there, like what the cat monster wants, which is basically just to be fed and left alone. Oh, that's right. They finally convinced it to fight for them against the critters the energy critters at the end. So they did finally manage to, get the thing off its butt and help them out, which was pretty important. So that was kind of good too. Well, anyway, so this preparation uh, tends to be fruitful in the long run because you look at it when you're done. You look at this kind of messy, written on thing when you're done, and then you circle stuff and say, okay, so that's still there, and this thing is going to respond to what just happened in this way. So you kind of use it to set up your next file by looking at all these parts and pieces that are still basically entities that can do things. And in a situation like this, which there isn't any time lapse between the sessions, I have to think in terms of how much time the various different entities had and what they knew. So the prep actually develops, including the parts they haven't seen and don't know about, actually develops as we go. So these techniques, I'm not sure if I'm being as clear about them as I could, but without them, we can't play. This is absolutely a responsibility on my part to do this as we continue. The idea that I have set up the dungeon and now I'm just going to be a bot that runs you through it is just not the way it works.